Hello, this is Lawrence Holgate, and this is episode 2 of Understanding Plato. I'm going to be doing this by looking at the dialogue as an example of philosophical method and how it differs from scientific method. By the way, those of you who want to follow along with me can grab a copy of my book, Understanding Plato, at my website, www.holgatebooks.com. Just make sure you spell Holgate, Houlgate, books.com. You can get a free copy of a book called Understanding Philosophy. And then if you just go down slide down the first page, click on the cover image that says Understanding Plato. It will take you to Amazon.com where you can quickly get a digital copy of the book. And then you can follow along as I read Chapter 2. I'm going to be reading and discussing at the same time. So let's get started. In Chapter 2, at Section 2.5, called Philosophical and Scientific Method. The word philosophy is from the Greek words philo, meaning love, and sophos, meaning wisdom or knowledge. So the word philosopher is someone who loves wisdom and the pursuit of knowledge. In ancient Greece, there was no distinction between philosophy and science. To be a scientist was to be a philosopher, and vice versa. Philosophy and science were one and the same discipline, both devoted to the pursuit of knowledge and motivated by the love of wisdom. Over the ensuing centuries, science gradually split off from philosophy as its own separate discipline, initially influenced in the Western world by the writings of Plato's famous student, Aristotle, who insisted that philosophers should always begin their pursuit of knowledge with a careful observation of things and events in the natural world. Observation has now become the first step in what is commonly referred to as the scientific method. The other steps are hypothesis, prediction, experimentation, and conclusion. As an illustration of these steps, I'm going to use an example of the instructions that are commonly given to high school students who want to enter a presentation in their annual science fair contest. Suppose that a young student has observed that one of the tomato plants in her parents' garden produces fewer tomatoes than the other plants. She wants an explanation of this. She wants to know why it happens. She makes careful observations about the amounts of water, plant food, and location. She notices that the plant with the lower yield of hormones is in partial shade and doesn't get as much sun each day as the other tomato plants. She wonders whether the amount of sunlight might have something to do with the amount of tomatoes produced by the plant. So on the advice of her teacher, she constructs the hypothesis that the more sunlight a tomato plant receives, the more tomatoes it will produce. That's the hypothesis, and it contains the prediction that a tomato plant will produce more tomatoes if subjected to more hours of direct sun. She designs an experiment to find out if her predictions are going to come out true or false. She then draws a conclusion on the basis of her experiment. The conclusion will show whether or not the result of the experiment supports the hypothesis. Now, one important word of caution. When a scientist constructs a hypothesis, it must be falsifiable. This means that there must be a possible way to prove that the prediction contained in the hypothesis is false. Suppose that the student's hypothesis is, quote, the more love and attention given to the plant by the goddess Demeter, the more tomatoes it will produce. But there's no experiment the student could design that would falsify this prediction. So it would and should be rejected as a possible hypothesis. By the way, Demeter was the ancient Greek goddess of corn, grain, and the harvest. And in a footnote 9 in this section, I say that we sometimes hear a survivor of a terrible accident say, God saved me. The philosophical question that we should ask would be, is this explanation falsifiable? Can we construct an experiment to prove that God did not intervene? And what would this experiment look like? If you can't come up with that, then just take the phrase God saved me and cast it off on the pile of meaningless statements. So how does the problem in the method used by Socrates in his discussion with Euthyphro compare to the problem and method used by our young scientist? Well, the first thing to note is that although Socrates begins his discussion with Euthyphro by listening to him describe the events that occurred on his property that day, you recall that from episode 1, the father described such things as his day laborer killing the household slave, the Euthyphro's father then killed the day laborer, etc. But this discussion about the description of the events really doesn't lead to another discussion about whether there should be more observation and investigation of the incident in the hope that they might discover more relevant facts. Instead, what happens is that Socrates and Euthyphro are really only interested in whether it is pious for Euthyphro to prosecute his father. If you don't understand the word pious, by the way, just put in the word just for the same thing. Was it just for Euthyphro to prosecute his father? Socrates does not challenge the facts as they are presented to him by Euthyphro. He wants to know whether these facts are sufficient to support Euthyphro's claim about piety. Before answering the particular question about Euthyphro's alleged piety, Socrates insists that the first question to ask is, what are the pious and the impious? In philosophy, we call this kind of question a conceptual question. We sometimes use the words logical or analytic to talk about this kind of question. It is a question about the meaning of a concept, not an empirical or synthetic question about the behavior of objects or events in the natural world. What it does is call on us to analyze and define a concept, not to report our observations or make predictions about whatever is named by the concept. So the method that the philosopher must employ begins with giving various possible answers to a conceptual question. The philosopher isn't examining arguments for or against these answers on the basis of non-philosophical observations. Rather, they're asking a conceptual question which asks us to look and see if any of the answers given by Euthyphro will pass the Elenchus test. Socrates wants to know whether the answers Euthyphro gives to his conceptual questions about the nature of piety conflict with other beliefs that he sincerely holds. And this is exactly what happens in definitions 1, 2, 3, and 4 that we discussed in episode 1. And also in episode 1, we discussed the responses of Socrates, the 4 responses. Now, it should become immediately obvious what the difference is between the philosophical method used by Plato in this dialogue and the scientific method used by the high school student in our example. Although both methods employ the technique of hypothesizing a solution, only the scientist would need to test the hypothesis empirically by observation and experimentation. Philosophers don't have laboratories in which they conduct experiments involving objects or events, nor do they have the equipment to manipulate them, nor would they ever need to go on field trips to distant sites where they can observe events and things in the natural world. A philosophical hypothesis can be examined from any location, preferably while sitting in a comfortable chair. And that explains, by the way, why doing philosophy is relatively inexpensive. You can do it anytime, anywhere, and without spending a dime to think through a problem and arrive at a conclusion. The only field trip a philosopher takes is entirely a field trip in her own mind, and any experiment she conducts is called a thought experiment. And what I mean by thought experiment is it's a device of the imagination that scientists and philosophers use to investigate the nature of things. We'll talk about this throughout our readings of the book. Now, here's a list of the steps that was proposed by an anonymous philosopher as a method for doing philosophy, and by the way, as a method for organizing your term paper. First, pose a question. Well, we have a question. What is piety? Secondly, refine the question into something explainable and conceivably answered. You might want to go to the dictionary and say something more about what the dictionary definition of piety is. That's step 2. Step 3, gather information and resources That is, do a literature search. What's the literature on the concept of piety? Number 4, provide various possible answers. You've looked at the literature. Maybe you've come up with 4 or 5 different answers to the question, what is piety? Describe them. Number 5, examine arguments for and against the various possible answers. Show why people have argued about it. What kind of refutation has been given of one or all of the answers of the word piety. Number 6, design arguments and thought experiments for and against the various possible answers. This means do your own thing. Do your own arguments and see what you come up with. And then analyze the results of your arguments. What possible answers have been shown to be just untenable? What do the various answers entail, and what are they entailed by? How does this affect the reasonableness of any given possible answer? Step 8, form a conclusion. Step 9, show the results and conclusions to a wide audience. Show it to your roommates, show it to your classmates. Number 10, reformulate or abandon as necessary in light of the responses. You might end up just chucking the whole thing because you got so many negative responses that you simply can't answer. Or perhaps nobody could respond to what you found. And you don't need to reformulate. Now, notice that the use of the phrases conceivably answerable and possible answers that were used in steps 2, 4, 5, and 6. For example, in question 2, refine the question into something explainable and conceivably answerable. Step number 2. Explainable and conceivably answerable. This means answers that can be shown to be false. Showing a definition of a concept to be false is usually a matter of providing a counterexample. And a counterexample is literally an example that runs counter to or falsifies what is claimed in the definition. For example, I use this all the time in my classes. I propose that the word bachelor means an unmarried person. And you're sitting in the audience and you say, well, Professor, I have a counterexample. My sister is unmarried, but she's not a bachelor. So I revise my definition. And I say, okay, I'll get rid of the just unmarried part, and we'll say a bachelor is an unmarried male. Well, you give me another counterexample. Wait a second, my 3-year-old nephew is unmarried, but no one would call him a bachelor. He's unmarried and he's a male, but no one call him a bachelor. So once again, I revise my definition by saying, all right, here's the last definition of bachelor. A bachelor is an unmarried male who is of legal age. That is, he's eligible to get married. Aha, I got you. Okay, so I've got you. But the question is, look at the process. Look at what happened with the word bachelor. It came up against counterexample after counterexample until finally you've got a definition. That's exactly what I want to happen with the definition of piety, or any concept that you come across. Now, let's suppose that I revise my definition to say that the word bachelor means any unmarried male of a legal age who has a soul. Not knowing what the word soul means, you wouldn't know how to falsify my definition. You would not be able to come up with a possible counterexample. As perhaps I explain to you that I'm trying to rule out zombies as potential bachelors, and the only way I can express this is by saying that all bachelors must have souls. Well, since my new definition cannot be falsified, I don't see what the falsification process would be, you would be justified in concluding that it's just meaningless. By analogy, if Euthyphro were to answer his question about the meaning of piety, and let's suppose he says that it is, quote, the sense of reverence placed in the human psyche by the great god Zeus, well, this is also not a possible answer. There's no way to falsify it. In testing the hypothesis, we might be able to show that a pious person need not have a sense of reverence, but there's no way to prove that all pious persons have had their psyche manipulated by Zeus. To repeat, if a hypothesis cannot be falsified, then it is without meaning, and we can ignore it in our pursuit of truth. We'll be talking about this many times in this book and in future books. the idea of falsification, the possibility of falsification as a necessary condition for a philosophical judgment or answer to be meaningful. All of Euthyphro's answers, if you look at them, if you go back to D1 through D4, definitions 1 through 4, they are possible. This is obvious by Socrates' 3 replies. In such cases, Socrates uses the elenchus to show that Euthyphro's answer implies beliefs that are unacceptable to Euthyphro. In response 1, meaning Socrates, shows that it is false to claim that piety means prosecuting my father for murder. It's false because piety is a general term applying to much more than a single instance of piety. It's as if I tried to define what humans are by saying, well, Tom over there, he's a human. I've just given a single instance of human, but I haven't defined human. You might say, yeah, Tom's a human, I can see that. But what does that tell me about the definition of human? What does it tell me about the concept? In reply 2, Socrates shows that piety cannot mean what the gods love because this entails the contradiction that one and the same thing can be both pious and impious at the same time. Some gods may think that what Euthyphro is doing, prosecuting his father, is pious. Other gods may disagree and say it's impious. And if you say that piety just means what the gods love, then you're going to get a contradiction. In reply 3, Socrates shows that piety cannot mean what all the gods love because this reply entails a dilemma, requiring that we accept one of 2 unacceptable consequences. Either we have to accept that we are ignorant of piety. We still don't know the meaning of piety because we don't know why the gods love it. That is the definition number 3, doesn't tell us anything about piety. We're still ignorant about it. Or the definition could mean the acceptance of the theory that all judgments about what is and is not pious are just arbitrary. That is, without any rational basis. In number 4, reply 4, Socrates shows that Euthyphro's definition is circular, taking us back to the original definition proposed in definition 1. By the way, a circular argument, you might write this down, is an argument in which the conclusion appears as a premise of the argument or as an implication of a premise of the argument. Circular arguments are also called begging the question. Consider the following argument. I say God exists because it says so in the Bible, and everything in the Bible is true because the Bible is the Word of God. That's the whole argument. I'll repeat it. God exists because it says God exists in the Bible, and everything in the Bible is true because the Bible is the Word of God. The premise, the Bible is the Word of God, assumes an affirmative answer to the question, does God exist? This reduces the argument to circularity. God exists because God exists. That's the argument. Won't do, will it? Finally, we should notice that the philosophical method laid out earlier is in some ways like the scientific method. Both start with a question or problem, and both begin with a hypothesis or possible solution. But that's where the similarity ends. The hypothesis of the scientist is a prediction about the future event in the natural world, about a future event in the natural world. For example, the young student is saying that the tomato plant placed in full sun will bear more tomatoes than the one planted in partial shade. She's giving a prediction about a future event. The hypothesis of the philosopher, or at least of Euthyphro, is about a definition of a concept. The scientist must test her prediction against the actual real-world results produced in her experiment. Philosophers aren't making predictions. They're not making predictions about events that will occur in the real world. Instead, following the methodology of the Socratic elenchus, they will test a proposed definition against alleged counterexamples. If the definition survives the counterexamples, or it must be altered to accommodate the counterexamples, then it can be applied to assess real-world behavior, including the behavior of Euthyphro. Perhaps that's the value of the philosophical method as it applies to moral concepts like piety and impiety, justice and injustice, right and wrong, good and bad. Once we have sorted an acceptable definition of these important concepts, we can engage the real world and make moral pronouncements about human behavior, evaluating and guiding our own conduct as well as the conduct of others. This is what Socrates does in his famous dialogue Apology, when he attempts to refute the charge of impiety that is brought against him by Meletus. Because for Socrates, this is not only a matter of evaluating his own conduct, as we shall soon find out in the next episode, it is also a matter of life or death. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you soon in episode